If all that copper emerged from beneath the Earth's surface, then who exactly was removing it? The descendant would later document that his grandfather had devoted the majority of his existence to evading discussions regarding the ancient copper excavations surrounding Lake Superior. Surveyors inquired about them. Missionaries questioned them. Mining entrepreneurs arriving from the Eastern Territories questioned them. The elderly gentleman typically responded to straightforward queries concerning weather patterns, fishing routes, winter passages, and the migration of wildlife through the woodlands. But conversations concerning the ancient excavations seldom continued for extended periods before he diverted the subject or simply ceased speaking altogether. That pattern shifted during the winter of 1888. By that time, the elder was already suffering from illness. His family recognized his approaching death, and according to the grandson's chronicle, the old man recognized it as well. One evening he summoned his grandson and requested that writing materials be brought into the chamber. The request itself was sufficiently unusual that the grandson remembered it decades afterward. The elderly man wanted records, not memories, not recollections, years later records. Over the subsequent 3 days, he discussed the copper territory of the upper Great Lakes with a degree of specificity that astonished even members of his own household. He spoke about locations on Isle Royale that his grandson had never visited. He spoke about ancient excavations on the Keweenaw Peninsula that were already regarded as prehistoric before industrial mining reached the region. He spoke about routes across the water that no longer existed in the configuration he described. Most significantly, he spoke about the excavations themselves as though they belonged to a history considerably more ancient than anyone surrounding him was prepared to conceive. By the late 19th century, government surveys had already commenced documenting thousands of prehistoric extraction pits throughout the Lake Superior region. Some of these hollows extended dozens of feet into the bedrock and contained stone hammers, wooden supports, and evidence of organized removal conducted over exceedingly lengthy periods. The existence of the excavations was not disputed. The magnitude of them was contentious because even in the 1880s, researchers were struggling to explain how societies assumed to be small, dispersed, and primarily seasonal had managed to extract such extraordinary quantities of copper from the earth. The elder had no interest in that debate. As far as he was concerned, the error had occurred much earlier. According to the grandson's documentation, his grandfather insisted that people kept asking the incorrect question. The question was never who discovered the excavations. The excavations did not require discovery. Everyone had always known they existed. The genuine question was who opened them first and why they had been working copper on a scale that later generations could barely account for. The elderly man described the excavations as inherited places. That word appears repeatedly in the grandson's account. Inherited, not constructed, not discovered. His people, according to the tradition he carried, had become stewards of locations that were already ancient when the oldest remembered narratives began. The people who first worked the copper belonged to a period he referred to repeatedly as the time before the silence, a phrase that appears throughout the surviving notes but is never fully elucidated. The grandson later wrote that every mention of it altered his grandfather's expression in a manner he struggled to characterize even decades afterward. During the first day of speaking, the grandson finally interrupted to pose the question that had been accumulating in his mind for hours. If the Ojibwe had inherited the excavations, who had worked them previously? The elderly man remained quiet for such an extended period that the grandson wondered whether he intended to respond at all. Finally, he spoke. The people who came before, he said, had arrived from the direction where the sun is oldest. The grandson recorded the sentence exactly as he heard it because he recognized immediately that he did not comprehend it. What he understood even less was what followed. By the second day, the conversation moved away from memory and toward measurements. The elderly man had never examined an archaeological report. He had never perused a geological survey. He knew nothing about isotope analysis. excavation records, or the terminology that universities would eventually create for the ancient copper industry of the Great Lakes. What he understood was scale. People who reside beside water understand scale better than most historians do. They understand how much labor it requires to move stone, how many individuals it requires to clear timber, how many hands are required to excavate a trench that survives generations. And according to the grandson's documentation, his grandfather believed the ancient copper workings around Lake Superior belonged to a world operating on a scale far larger than the one history eventually assigned to it. The excavations themselves are not controversial. Thousands of ancient pits exist across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. Stone hammers weighing 20 and 30 pounds have been recovered beside them. Fire setting was employed to fracture the rock. Wooden shoring was utilized in deeper excavations. In some locations, mining activity extended over such vast areas that early surveyors struggled to determine where one operation concluded and another commenced. The question that troubled the elder was the same question that still troubles researchers today. Where did the copper go? Because copper behaves differently from most materials used by ancient societies. Iron rusts, wood rots, textiles disintegrate, copper endures. If enormous quantities of native copper were removed from the Great Lakes over thousands of years, traces of that activity should still exist in corresponding quantities across the archaeological record. Instead, the numbers refuse to align. Copper from Lake Superior appears in Ohio. It appears in Illinois. It appears in Louisiana. It appears in burial mounds and ceremonial sites separated by thousands of miles. The trade network clearly existed. The scale of extraction suggests something even larger existed alongside it. The elder apparently returned to this point repeatedly during the second day. His grandson later wrote that his grandfather believed people had become distracted by the excavations themselves and stopped asking questions about the organization required to operate them. Mines do not dig themselves. Copper does not transport itself. Thousands of pits spread across islands and peninsulas do not appear without planning, transportation systems, food production, seasonal coordination, and generations of accumulated understanding. The elderly man was not contending that his ancestors lacked those capabilities. He was contending something different. He believed the excavations belonged to a period when the world around Lake Superior was organized very differently from the one that existed in 1888. That was when the grandson returned to the mysterious people his grandfather had mentioned the day before, the people from the direction where the sun is oldest. This time, the elderly man spoke more deliberately. According to the notes, he explained that his ancestors and these earlier miners had not been enemies, rivals, or conquerors. They had shared the copper country. They understood the metal differently and utilized it differently. But both groups considered the deposits around the Great Lake important enough to protect and important enough to remember. The distinction mattered because later generations would discuss ownership. The elder discussed stewardship. Then the conversation reached the sentence that would become one of the most discussed lines in the surviving document. The elderly man told his grandson that the people before the silence did not simply take copper from the ground. They listened to it. The grandson admitted decades later that he never fully understood what his grandfather meant by that phrase. Neither, apparently, had his grandfather intended him to. Some knowledge, he was told, survives one generation only long enough to reach another generation that can finally comprehend it. His responsibility was not to explain the words. His responsibility was to preserve them long enough for someone else to attempt understanding. By the third day, the grandson had stopped interrupting. Whenever he posed a direct question, his grandfather rarely answered it directly anyway. Instead, he expanded outward from the question, adding details slowly until the shape of the answer appeared independently. The question that morning was straightforward. Who were the first miners? The elderly man never provided them with a name. That detail would frustrate the grandson for the remainder of his existence because names can be investigated. Names can be compared with maps, languages, and migrations. Descriptions are much more difficult to trace. The elder described them only as people who came from the direction where the sun is oldest, a phrase that appeared several times in the notes and nowhere with additional explanation. Whether he meant east across the water, an older homeland, or something else entirely remains impossible to determine from the surviving document. What survives more clearly is the elder's description of their relationship with copper. According to the grandson, his grandfather became noticeably impatient whenever people described ancient mining as a simple search for tools or trade goods. Copper was useful, certainly, but usefulness alone does not explain the scale of the extraction. Thousands of pits, millions of pounds removed from the earth, generations of labor spread across islands, shorelines, and forests surrounding the largest lake on the continent. People do not maintain projects like that for centuries unless the material they are extracting occupies a central position in their understanding of the world around them. The elder insisted that the first miners constructed places near the water specifically because the water mattered to the work. The grandson recorded this carefully because his grandfather repeated it several times. The excavations were one part of the system. The water was another. Separating the two made the narrative cease making sense. Exactly what role the lakes played in the process was never explained in terms the grandson felt comfortable translating into English decades later. But he was clear about one thing. His grandfather considered the lakes as important to the copper as the excavations themselves. Then came one of the strangest phrases in the entire account. The elder spoke about structures that once stood along the shorelines and around the mining regions, which he described using words that the grandson eventually translated as dressed in earth. The grandson admitted he did not know whether this meant buried structures deliberately covered, or something else entirely. His grandfather apparently assumed the meaning was obvious and never paused to explain it. The phrase simply continued, appearing in the conversation as though both men already understood what it signified. Decades later, only one of them still did. The elderly man believed some of these places still existed. Not standing, not visible, present. That distinction mattered enough that the grandson underlined it in his notes. The structures had not disappeared. They had become difficult to recognize. The elder spoke about changes in the movement of water across the ground, changes in vegetation, and changes in animal behavior around certain locations that his lineage had learned to observe over generations. To him, these were not mysteries. They were signs, evidence that something remained below the surface long after the people who constructed it had vanished from memory. By this point, the grandson had begun to understand that his grandfather was not describing a tribe, a settlement, or a single forgotten culture. He was describing an entire landscape that once functioned differently from the one surrounding them in 1888. The excavations belonged to that landscape. The structures belonged to that landscape. The knowledge belonged to that landscape. And according to the elderly man, all of it existed before the event he referred to only as the silence. The grandson finally posed the question that had been following the conversation since the first night. What happened to them? According to the notes, his grandfather remained quiet for an extended period before responding. Then he gave the sentence that appears near the end of the surviving pages, and perhaps explains why he waited until the conclusion of his existence to speak at all. They were not taken by war, they were not taken by winter. They were taken by what came after. They took too much at once. By the afternoon of the third day, the grandson understood that every path in the narrative eventually led back to one moment. The excavations led there. The buried structures led there. The disappearance of the first miners led there. Every time he attempted to redirect the conversation elsewhere, his grandfather eventually returned to the same place. The silence, not a war, not an invasion, not the arrival of another people. The elderly man spoke about it as though it were a change in the world itself rather than a conflict within it. The grandson later admitted this was the portion of the conversation he struggled most to record because his grandfather was describing ideas that seemed to exist comfortably in Ojibwe but resisted translation into English. The first change involved water. The elderly man spoke about rivers moving differently than they had previously, and about shorelines behaving in ways his ancestors had not expected. He described water arriving where it had not arrived before, and failing to arrive where it always had. Whether he was speaking about floods, changing lake levels, altered waterways, or something more complicated than any of those things, the grandson never became confident enough to decide. He recorded the words exactly as he received them and left the interpretation to whoever came later. The second change involved communication. This was the aspect that troubled the grandson most, because his grandfather clearly believed he was describing something real and practical, while the language itself sounded nearly impossible to translate. The elderly man insisted that before the silence there existed forms of exchange and understanding that disappeared afterward. Not literacy, not trade, not diplomacy, something older and broader than those things. The grandson later wrote that his grandfather spoke about this loss with the same certainty a farmer speaks about weather, or a sailor speaks about currents. To the elderly man, the disappearance of that connection was not philosophy. It was history. Then the conversation returned to the miners themselves. According to the surviving notes, the elder believed the people who first worked the copper understood that something was changing before everyone else did. Some departed, some remained, some buried what they could not transport away, and some, according to the elderly man, prepared certain things specifically for the people who would come after them. The phrase the grandson struggled most to translate eventually became sealed for later. He admitted that the English words felt incomplete, but they were the closest equivalent he could discover decades afterward. While documenting the account sealed for later, not hidden forever, not destroyed, not abandoned, preserved for a time that had not arrived yet. The elderly man apparently believed that many of the structures near the excavations belonged to this category. They had not been erased by accident. They had not disappeared naturally. They had been placed beyond immediate reach deliberately by people who anticipated someone else finding them when the conditions were appropriate. The grandson wrote that his grandfather spoke about this with complete certainty and no sense that he was describing speculation or legend. To him, this was inherited knowledge carrying the same status as the location of fishing grounds or winter routes through the forests. The difference was that one category of knowledge was shared freely. The other was carried carefully. Late that evening, the grandson finally posed the question that had been waiting behind every other question. What caused the silence? The elderly man remained quiet long enough that the grandson wondered whether he intended to respond. When he finally spoke, the response occupied only a few lines in the surviving notes but would become the most discussed passage in the entire document. According to the grandson's transcription, his grandfather simply said, "They took too much at once." Then, after an extended pause, he added another sentence, "and something answered." The elderly man never explained what had answered. The grandson never asked. By that point, he had started understanding something that only became clearer after his grandfather's death. Some knowledge survives because it is explained. Other knowledge survives because it is repeated exactly as it was received. His responsibility was not interpretation. His responsibility was preservation. 3 weeks later, the elderly man was gone. The elder finished speaking near sunset on the third day. According to the grandson's account, there was no dramatic ending to the conversation, no final warning, no final revelation. The elderly man simply stopped. For 3 days he had carried his grandson through mines, forgotten shorelines, buried structures, vanished people, and a world that he believed had existed long before the oldest stories anyone around him still remembered. Then suddenly there was nothing left to add. The burden had moved. That was enough. 3 weeks later he was dead. The grandson would spend decades wondering why his grandfather had chosen that particular winter to speak. Why not 10 years earlier? Why not 20? Why wait until the very end? Eventually, he arrived at an answer. His grandfather had not been attempting to convince anyone. He had not been attempting to win an argument with historians, archaeologists, or government officials who would never read his words anyway. He had simply reached the point where carrying the memory alone was no longer feasible. Someone else needed to carry it. The strange thing is that the world outside the cabin seemed to be asking many of the same questions at exactly the same moment. Government surveyors were documenting ancient mining pits across the Lake Superior Basin. Archaeologists were struggling to explain the scale of extraction. Researchers were discovering evidence of trade networks stretching thousands of miles across North America. The evidence existed. The explanations often felt smaller than the evidence itself. The excavations remain. The hammerstones remain. The ancient pits on Isle Royale remain. The copper signature from Lake Superior continues appearing in archaeological sites scattered across an entire continent. And the question that troubled the elderly man in 1888 remains stubbornly alive more than a century later. If the amount of copper removed from the Great Lakes was truly as large as many estimates suggest, what kind of society was capable of organizing that work? Because mining on that scale is not simply a technical problem. It is a logistical problem, a transportation problem, a food problem, a labor problem. It requires planning, coordination, generations of accumulated understanding. Those things rarely exist in isolation. Perhaps future excavations will answer those questions. Perhaps they will not. History is full of civilizations that were invisible until the moment someone decided to dig in the appropriate location. The elderly man believed some of those places still existed, not lost, not destroyed, waiting beneath forests, waiting beneath shorelines, waiting beneath the soil that had slowly gathered over them across generations until memory faded faster than stone. The grandson preserved the document for the remainder of his existence. He shared portions of it carefully and reluctantly, not because he believed the knowledge was dangerous, but because he believed it was easy to mishandle. There is a difference. Some narratives survive by being told to everyone. Others survive because a small number of people decide they are worth carrying. The elderly man understood that difference. Perhaps that is why he waited until the final weeks of his life before speaking at all. And perhaps that leaves us with the same question his grandson carried away from that cabin in the winter of 1888. Not did the copper mines exist? We know they existed. Not did enormous quantities of copper leave the Great Lakes? We know they did. The question that remains is much simpler. Who were the people standing on the shores of Lake Superior when the first hammer struck the first vein of copper? Because whoever they were, the elderly man believed they expected to be remembered. And somewhere beneath the forests of the upper Great Lakes, they may still be waiting for someone to remember them properly.